Right, I'm just going to introduce our panelists and our chair for today. So Dr. Michael Auslin is the inaugural Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and a Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's published several books and frequently contributes to leading newspapers and other publications and has won several awards. And then joining us from Tokyo is Dr. Yasushi Watanabe, Professor of Public Diplomacy and American Studies at Keio University. He took his PhD from Harvard, and as well as having researched at both Cambridge and Oxford, has also had positions at several other leading universities in other countries around the world. And he also has published books mostly related to soft power type of issues. And Dr. Yu Jie is Senior Research Fellow on China in the Asia-Pacific program at Chatham House, and she focuses on China's foreign policy and economic diplomacy. And there's wide demand for her advice, both from governments, including the UK government, and from leading companies. So our chair today is going to be Gideon Rachman. He is the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. He hosts an international affairs podcast. He too has written several books, and he's won several prizes for his journalism. And I'm going to hand over to Gideon Rachman now.
Thank you very much, Jason. And thanks for bringing me to host this thing with three old friends who are dotted around the world, Michael Auslin and Yu Jie and Professor Watanabe. So I think, given that the question is about US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the global power implications of that, it makes sense to start in Washington. So Michael, you know, it's still quite fresh in our minds, but a lot of people are saying, is this a sign that America's pulling back from the world, that is turning inwards, and that a lot of American security guarantees around the world now can be taken less for granted? What's your take?
Well, Gideon, thanks. First, let me thank the Daiwa Anglo Foundation for inviting me, for hosting this. And always been a big fan of the work you do and the fine scholars that you've supported in the past. So it's a pleasure to join you from DC. Thanks for the easy question, Gideon. I think I will do the usual DC thing. I will invoke Zhou Enlai and say it's just too early to tell. But I think some of the contours are actually fairly clear, which have, I would say, as much to do with domestic politics now in the United States as they will in terms of US foreign and security policy and the reactions and implications for our relations with our partners and with those who are not our partners. I think the way to interpret part of what the effect of the Afghanistan withdrawal will be is of course to look at the evolution of US foreign and security policy over the past decade or so, and particularly since Donald Trump came into office, but certainly could be extended back into Barack Obama's administration with the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia, meaning that the weight of US foreign policy, security policy, of course, had been shifting towards the Indo-Pacific. And Afghanistan, which was a completely, was a new situation for the United States to be involved in a war or have combat operations going on for 2 decades. It was something that is very uncomfortable for Americans who are used, of course, to much shorter wars and finishing the job, mission accomplished, and getting out. I venture to say that if you had, gone out on the street and before the withdrawal from Afghanistan and asked Americans whether we were still fighting there, most of them would have actually said no. Of course, our combat presence was very small, though those important in terms of maintaining support for the then Afghan government. But the mindset of the United States had already shifted away towards the Indo-Pacific, towards other regions at certain points, such as Russia. So from that perspective, I don't think what happened in Afghanistan is going to be, is going to fundamentally change the trajectory that the United States was already on. The question, of course, is one of credibility. It's one of competence. It's one of what reactions might the U.S. itself take in order to try to mitigate the blowback from this debacle of a withdrawal, and quite frankly, what seems to be a tragic waste of thousands of lives and 20 years and trillions of dollars. And so from that perspective, there's really two elements that I would just highlight before turning it over back to you. One, of course, is the reaction on the part of adversaries and as well as potential partners, whether the United States actually can think strategically, whether it has a clear plan, whether for itself it understands what it wants to do and how to do it. And I think that is certainly being questioned. And then back at home, which is the idea that if you are going to spend decades of national treasure in terms of lives and money and then throw it away at the end, then what is the point of being engaged in the world? What do you actually get from it? So I think that the easy response for the United States then is to flex muscles in very short, sharp, strategic points, a sort of Jacksonian response to show that we're still here, we still can do what we want when we want to do it. But I think the next decade will really tell the tale of whether we have a strategic vision for the world and our role in it.
Thanks, Michael. That's a very clear setting out of the issues. So now I'd like to turn to Dr. Yu Jie, if I may. And you said when we were just talking before the show that it's been almost 2 years since you've been able to go back to China, but you followed very, very closely. So obviously, as Michael was suggesting, a key question is about as much about perception of what's happened as about any objective reality. So how do you think in Beijing they have been reading the withdrawal from Afghanistan, particularly as it relates to the increasingly overt competition between America and China?
Thank you, Gideon, for this. And also let me also thank Daiwa Anglo Foundation, firstly to support Chatham House, but also secondly to have invited me here to put up this panel together. Now, Gideon, come back to your question and also to Michael's answer. I mean, I noticed one word that Michael used, which is inward looking. I think China perhaps also on a similar trajectory, but become very selectively inward looking on its foreign policy. So interesting debate on Afghanistan within Beijing that you hear all different noises. You hear on the one hand, someone like Zhou Bo and saying that China is ready to fill the void to begin the rebuilding process of Afghanistan and fill the gap that left by United States. Whereas on the other hand, you hear many other policymakers and academics suggested saying, no, this is definitely not China's responsibility to rebuild Afghanistan, and let's just leave as it is. So judging by the official responses from MFA and Beijing, what I've found is that it seems that Beijing take a very cautious approach when it comes to Afghanistan issue, which is to say that not taking too much side as such, apart from offering economic assistance to the Taliban regime so far. I mean, that's as far as limited what Beijing has done. Because clearly Beijing has learned lessons from the United States that by having any sort of geopolitical overstretch, and then that will do too much damage to the Chinese domestic political economy. And also let's put in the background of that, at the moment, Beijing is going through a process of so-called economic transition. This idea of the so-called dual circulation has been largely put into practice. So while we're talking about dual circulation in here is that China's economy from now on has to based on domestic consumption and domestic production, and also let's encourage foreign direct investment from Beijing or from China to all of the world. So instead of you have seen China Inc. buys up the world like what we have seen before the pandemic, and what we have seen so far is that most of the Chinese state capitals and state-owned enterprises are less interested in investing places like in Eastern European countries or Latin America. But instead, the resources will be redistributed back home or selectively in the Asia-Pacific region, because ultimately Beijing realized Beijing can utilize that sense of economic interdependence with the Asia-Pacific economies in order to combating on the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. And that seems to be the card Beijing is playing at the moment. But however, I think the really dangerous element of what we experienced so far, it is what will happen or what might happen in Taiwan, judging by the rhetoric offered by Xi Jinping last weekend. That seems to be a stunt speech that's suggesting China's determination to reunify with the island. And I actually calculated the timeline. According to the two speeches Xi Jinping made, firstly on the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party on the 1st of July, and also on a speech last weekend, that the time limit of resolving the Taiwan issue is merely about 28 years, because part of Xi Jinping's China dream, it is a so-called national rejuvenation. Therefore, part of the national rejuvenation is that sense of territorial integrity. Therefore, Taiwan is part of the calculation. So within 28 years time, Beijing firstly will have to prepare on this, whatever, perhaps the military conflicts, perhaps the peaceful reunification with Taiwan, whereas on the other hand, also building its own economic resilience to prepare the worst yet to come on its competition with the United States. So I think to go forward, Xi Jinping's term referring to US-China relations is protracted conflict. I mean, I don't use the word protracted in here lightly. It is the way how Mao described China-Japan conflicts back to the 1930s, that sense of protracted conflict between China and Japan. And now Xi Jinping borrowed a similar term by suggesting the relationship between China and the United States entering a period of protracted war. So that's where we are. And we are going to see a much more inward-looking China, but very selectively, but also coupled together with very hostile diplomacy measures come from Beijing at the same time. And whether the Asia-Pacific region be able to bear that, and we shall wait and see.
Indeed. So on to Professor Watanabe, who is joining us from Japan. How do you think the American withdrawal from Afghanistan has been interpreted in Tokyo? Do they see it as a necessary refocusing on the main challenge of China, or do they see it as a sign that maybe they can't really rely on the US military as they have in the past? What are the competing schools?
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for having me in this important session. I always appreciate the great effort of the Anglo Foundation for bridging closer communication between UK and Japan and the rest of the world. I think there was a certain surprise and disappointment at the way President Biden handled the whole situation. There was a concern that this might be the indication that the United States is withdrawing from the world more and more. But I don't necessarily buy into that idea. And actually, a fair number of people say that the reason the President Biden decided to withdraw from Afghanistan is to shift the resources from the Middle East to this part of the world in the Pacific region. And as you know, Japan has been feeling the pressure and threat from China for the past 15 or 20 years over the Senkaku Island. And now our sense of fear is finally getting shared by the United States and also the rest of the world, I mean the like-minded countries. And in that respect, the recent development and President Biden's commitment to Quad among the US, Japan, Australia, and India, as well as the AUKUS among the UK, the US, and Australia, is very much encouraging. And so in that sense, I don't think nowadays that the US is even the relationship with United States even regarded as even more important than ever before. And also not only with the United States, but for instance, recently the HMS Queen Elizabeth came over to Japan, and also France and Germany and UK, of course, have expressed their interest in this part of the world. So Quad plus France, Germany, and UK are very much encouraging. So The withdrawal itself has a little bit of negative repercussion on the mind of Japanese people, but I don't mean to say that this is the total disappear of the United States. Rather, there's a new development going on, and I think many Japanese appreciate it.
Yeah. So, Michael, I mean, what Professor Watanabe's been saying is something I heard. I was actually in Washington last week, and the line from the administration people I saw was similar, which is that obviously we're not withdrawing. Look how quickly we came up with AUKUS. Look at the Quad Summit. We're not withdrawing. We're refocusing. Do you buy that essentially, or do you think that, as one skeptic put it to me, they may be refocusing on core interests, but Afghanistan shows that you can move from being marginal to core to marginal with striking speed. So people might not be totally reassured by the refocus.
Oh, well, I think that last point I don't think is particularly compelling. I don't think anyone would compare the importance of the Indo-Pacific and the importance of our generational long alliances with Afghanistan, as tragic as it is, and as much as we now once again, 20 years later, need to be concerned about Taliban and Al Qaeda and non-state actors. But the idea that the Indo-Pacific is going to go from being core to being marginal, I think that's wrong. Again, the developments that the Biden administration have been undertaking have followed on from the resetting of U.S.-China relations under the Trump administration, what I think was a policy of reciprocity in terms of attempting to shape Chinese behavior, whether you saw it through the tariffs, you saw it through the resumption of the Quad, and of course the actual structuring of U.S. strategic documents, something that I know that Britain has undergone with its integrated review last year. The U.S. has been doing that as well. I think first of all, almost everyone in the Biden administration was in the Obama administration. And so not only are they not new to the region, they also have a track record and experience. And if there was one critique of the Obama administration's Asia policy, it's that it was largely rhetoric without a lot of beef to back it up. We saw rampant cyber activity on the part of the Chinese, cyber espionage. We saw the militarization of the South China Sea and the like, and of course the increasing and growing threat to Taiwan. So on the one hand, instead of saying that the Indo-Pacific can go from core to marginal, what we could say is that once again, all of this might turn out to be rhetoric. Now, I think the building blocks are coming together with AUKUS, with Quad. In DC, there are those, and I'm among them, who are talking about increasing Quad, being a Quad plus, particularly trying to bring the UK and get that more involved with the plans that we're doing. Certainly the support for Taiwan that began under, the US has supported Taiwan obviously for 40 years, but the enhanced support for Taiwan that began under the Trump administration has been continued under the Biden administration. And so it sort of depends, Gideon, how you want to look at it. Either you can look at it and say that the US is really getting its act together in terms of the policies to support, a strategy to actually support its national goals, or it's going to stumble into conflict with China because it is blustering and it is pressing on red lines and third rails that Beijing simply will not back down from. So I think it's interesting. I just wanted to mention two things that Cherry brought up. One, the question of geopolitical overstretch. I don't think the US was geopolitically overstretched in Afghanistan. We can argue about the length of the mission and the like, but by the withdrawal, we only had 2,500 troops. And by all accounts, had they stayed and been there to support a government that was continuing to function, the outcome would have been different. So it's not as if we had 100,000 or 200,000 troops in Afghanistan for 20 years with no result. Instead, at what was a fairly low cost, we were maintaining the government. Now, the viability of that government clearly was not there, but I don't think it's quite imperial overstretch. The other thing that's very interesting that Cherry mentioned was 28 years, because I would counter that with 5 years, because our leading admirals in the Pacific, currently Admiral Aquilino, who heads up Indo-Pacific Command, and before him, Admiral Davidson, did not foresee at all that it would take 28 years for there to be a crisis moment over Taiwan. They're predicting within less than a decade. And certainly when you look at the type of activity and military activity around Taiwan today, it's easy for someone to say China's ready to move in. I don't actually think that's the case. But if the Chinese are talking about 28 years and the Americans are talking about 5 years, we have a real mismatch of communication there, and therefore a misunderstanding of intentions. I think that's an important point that needs to be drawn out.
Yeah, no, Cherry, and I meant to ask you about Chinese intentions, because again, it was striking to me in Washington last week. If you talk to the people in the Biden team and say, what do you think China thinks? The reply I got quite frequently was that we think that China thinks America is in inexorable decline, and that China now intends essentially to displace America as the world's leading power. I don't know what you think of that analysis. Does that ring true to you?
No, it doesn't ring true to me at all. I mean, yes, we hear quite a lot of Chinese so-called experts talking about US decline quite frequently. And also it seems to be that it's also in line with what Washington thinking about China. But if you carefully examining whatever the Policy Bureau statement and read out, you notice that the word of United States is nowhere to be seen, but only one sentence which really intrigues me, that the opening sentence, which has been widely covered in here, including your paper, Gideon, that the East is in rise and the West is in decline. But the second half of the sentence, which I consider is more important, that is suggested that China has now facing the unprecedented challenge, which have not been seen in the last 100 years. Clearly, that leadership realized itself cannot just continuously run this kind of like a long-term conflicts, kind of like Cold War type of conflicts with the United States. And things will have to draw end to some extent, one way to another. So I wouldn't completely just argue that China believe now the United States is in definite decline as such. I mean, otherwise China would not issue on its so-called 2035 technology self-reliance. And part of the reason that China's acknowledge the gap, the technology gap that China has with the United States, including in some key industrial sectors. And therefore, China will have to pursue that so-called self-reliance strategy on technology in order to match and close that gap. I mean, you don't really follow a decline power. You don't really try to close the gap with a decline power. But what you're trying to do is you try to catch up with a hegemon. So I think the phrase that the West is in decline seems to overplay in the ears of many external analysts of China, but I think less so associated with most of the academics and within China, which helped the establishment, the political establishment in Beijing to formulate its foreign policy.
Before I hand over to Yasushi, can I just press you on the point that Michael was highlighting, 5 versus 28 years?
Sure.
I mean, do you think it is conceivable that China would move within this line of 5 years, or is it really, we're talking 3 decades?
I mean, I'm more inclined to thinking in over 3 decades, because this is something to do with how Xi Jinping would like to be remembered for himself. Is he like to be remembered by someone who will bring China become the middle to high level income country? So for his 2035 goal, according to his 14th 5 years plan, or alternatively, he wants to be remembered that he has reunified the country by having military action with Taiwan, but largely led into China entering economic turmoil. I mean, so he has to weigh down. So at the end of the day, I think it's not just a political calculation. It is also an economic calculation for China. What really justify the Communist Party's legitimacy? Because for me, at the moment, it seems to be that legitimacy still resting on economic performance so far. So that's why I suggested 28 years, but not 5 years. And also bear in mind that after 5 years, if the leadership reshuffle goes well next year, so during the 20th Party Congress, I mean, we're likely to see perhaps a successor might emerge from the Politburo, and then probably that's going to take another 5 years and to sort of finish off the leadership transition. So we're having the leadership transition, we're having the economic rebalancing, and China just simply can't afford to have military conflicts with Taiwan.
Okay, well, it's good to hear. Yasushi, where do you stand on this question of U.S. decline and how reliable America is going to be going forward? And I should mention to the audience, you've just published a book on white nationalism and study America very closely. And one name we haven't, I think, remarkably mentioned yet is Donald Trump. But obviously, the thought, that Trump may be back and his commitment or otherwise to American democracy does bear very heavily on how reliable the United States is as an international actor. So how do you think the domestic situation of the United States affects people's perceptions of America in Japan and elsewhere?
Well, in Japan, after the withdrawal, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was often the voice that after all, Joe Biden is same with Donald Trump in pursuing the America First initiative. It's probably more sophisticated than Trump's America First one, but essentially the same. But I tend to disagree with it. Yes, certainly both Biden and Trump declared that the United States is not going to be the policeman for the world, just as President Obama said that. But the approach is quite contrasting, whereas the President Trump thought that the international multilateral framework itself is a burden for the United States. It actually works against national interest of the United States. However, both Obama and Biden think that the U.S. doesn't act alone, but it works with the other like-minded countries. And in sort of mobilizing and forming and mobilizing the multilateral framework, the United States is going to take a lead or show the leadership. And I think that's the kind of approach Biden is pursuing with the case of Quad and the AUKUS. So I think, right after the Vietnam War, everybody was saying that this is the end of U.S. leadership or U.S. hegemony, but it was not. So now we tend to be buying into this familiar thesis of U.S. declining or with U.S. withdrawing from the world. But I think I'm a little bit careful about that kind of discourse.
Okay. I should note at this point that if you want to ask questions, we'll come to the audience in about 10 minutes' time. I can see one has come through on the chat. The other way you can do it, as I think Jason pointed out, is you can raise your hand virtually on Zoom, and if that should come to my attention. So, Michael, back to you. One way in which the American domestic situation seems to me to affect America's ability to assert its power or leadership in the Indo-Pacific is on trade. China has now ironically applied to join the CPTPP, this thing America constructed and Japan kept alive. One of the Biden team said to me that he felt personally that if America didn't have an economic component to its pushback against China, it would lose ultimately. And yet they'd love to join, theoretically, join TPP, but they can't. So how far do you think that this, sort of paralysis in American economic policy, international economic policy, which stems from the domestic problems, is a problem for America in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, I certainly agree with you. And I think it's a problem for Joe Biden because his own party won't support an accession or reaccession to CPTPP. And it was a problem, for Barack Obama, who was trying to get the chorus agreement through Congress that was held up by Nancy Pelosi. So this is something that the Democrats have struggled with to have the U.S. re-enter or create new large trading agreements. Now, that said, What the Trump administration always said was that it wasn't against free trade, it wanted fair trade. And so it actually concluded a services agreement with Japan that didn't get much attention, but it was a free trade agreement on goods and services with Japan, and they wanted to use that as a model for others. Of course, they renegotiated. They didn't pull out of any trade agreements other than TPP. They renegotiated those, such as the NAFTA agreement, and they also concluded one or did one with the UK. So it's not that the US left the free trade table. It's that as with so much that I think, by the way, would have happened whether it was Hillary Clinton in 2017 or Donald Trump in 2017, the US was renegotiating its own engagement with international institutions. Don't forget, Hillary Clinton also said that she would pull out of TPP where she elected. It wasn't just Donald Trump. But I agree with you. This is a big problem, and it's a big problem not just on trade. It's a huge problem on infrastructure, right? The big thing that the U.S. has not had an answer to has been the One Belt and One Road. They've come up with some actually somewhat innovative and interesting alternatives, such as the Blue Dot Network, but they're not large enough. The Blue Dot Network, by the way, started by the Trump administration, is with allies such as Japan. It could be larger. So again, the idea that, you know, what Yasushi said, I understand and I agree with in general. The Trump administration was worried about international institutions. It wasn't against international cooperation and international institutions. It wanted to restructure them, and it only got to go so far, but it created the Blue Dot with partners. Obviously, it restarted the Quad with partners. So it did a number of things that were underneath this much more, I don't know how you'd put it, you know, sort of shocking rhetoric of the US now looking after its own interests. But if you actually look at the rhetoric, you know, Biden's rhetoric towards China is much harsher than Trump's was. Trump was hammered because he kept saying, "I love Xi Jinping. We're good friends. He's a great man." And then they would do things like the trade tariffs, right? On the other hand, Biden has, you know, called Xi Jinping a thug, said he doesn't have a democratic bone in his body, invited the Taiwanese to his inauguration, which was a very good thing, by the way. But I think, you know, we have to be very honest about how both sides are approaching this. And really, you can lump it into one big basket of the US trying to figure out the next generation of US-China relations after 40 years of unrestrained engagement. That's really where we are. It's not Democrat, it's not Republican. It is a combination of both, looking at the domestic issues that you raised, and it's also looking at where can we best act abroad and how do we best act abroad.
Right. So, Cherry, I mean, you said earlier that China sees its trump card really as its network of economic ties, particularly in Asia. And we were just discussing now with Michael that America is struggling to respond to that. But it seems to me that China's used its ties both as a sort of, you know, the classic carrot and the stick, you know, that it's an attraction, but also they've at times rounded on trading partners, South Korea, most notably Australia recently. Do you think they've sorted out in their mind how they're going to play this? Are there any regrets about using economic ties as a weapon?
Well, Gideon, I think that's precisely the dilemma for the Chinese foreign policy nowadays. I mean, I consider this as being, seems to be the permanent dilemma between, on the one hand, have this very hawkish diplomatic rhetoric, and whereas on the other hand, out of economic necessity, that China does need to have more trading partners. I mean, so far the scenario is that if we look into RCEP and then we look into CPTPP, I mean, out of the 15 members of RCEP, that China has the larger trading volumes with those 14 countries, except one, because that one has no diplomatic relation with China. So clearly the economic might is already there. And then what I've also noticed quite interestingly that while Australia, UK, and United States announced AUKUS on that day, then following day, China immediately made a formal announcement suggesting itself would join CPTPP, just to show that it's still very much interested, economically engaged with the Asian Pacific economies in there. Because I think also those small to medium-sized countries in Southeast Asia are feared the most that Southeast Asia will now become another battlefield in terms of arms race. So what China is intended to do, it is to offering that sense of economic reassurance, that economic interdependence. But however, China's credibility on economic side will be undermined and hugely undermined by the rampant action of the People's Liberation Army in order to building a blue navy, and also in terms of modernizing its navy and air forces, and therefore increasing military competition within the Indo-Pacific. So I think China is playing on both cards, but Beijing has not really formulated a coherent strategy yet, while how to play with this economic trump card, while on the other hand, develop its PLA capability. Because don't forget, even though that PLA are under the wing of Xi Jinping, PLA are under the full control of Xi Jinping, which has never happened in his predecessor, but this happened now. But on the other hand, it's a very strong argument for China's economic and technology self-reliance. And therefore, a part of the self-reliance on technology is also military technology, try to give a chance to try. So PLA may try to seek whatever the reason they be able to have in order to have some kind of military goals with whoever in the Asia-Pacific.
Okay, Yasushi, last question to you before I take some from the audience. How does Japan see this question of economic interdependence? Because you can see it from two angles. I guess the Japanese, still China's the largest trading partner, biggest market, but Japan has also experienced in living memory anti-Japanese trade or consumer boycotts in China. There are, as you said, the Senkaku disputes. Have they resolved this question of being so economically dependent on a country with which they have very difficult relations?
So I think the bottom line for Japan is to maintain the liberal international order, or particularly the rule-based order, free and open trade. And certainly China is a big trading partner. And as long as the general trade, I mean the non-sensitive goods are concerned, I think many Japanese support continuing trade with China. But when it comes to sensitive goods, like the 5G and semiconductors and so on, probably Japan is more careful and selective in working with China. And the interesting development in the past few days is, as you know, that we have a new Prime Minister, Kishida, and I think Kishida administration is unlikely to drop the posture of hardline stance against China. And he served as the foreign minister for almost 5 years in the second Abe administration. And also he needs the support of the conservative action of LDP to stay in power. So that means, but he's from the so-called Kochikai, the more liberal faction of LDP. So he's probably pursuing the possibility of dialogue and cooperation as much as possible with China, but still there's a limit to it. And in terms of timetable, there's going to be a Winter Olympic in Beijing in February, and also 50th anniversary of the normalization of diplomatic relations between China and Japan at the end of next September. So next year will bring an important opportunity for dialogue and cooperation. But it's also the political season in Japan with the upper house election coming up in summer. And according to the recent public opinion poll, around 90% of Japanese people have a negative image of China. So it's unrealistic to imagine a large-scale exchange or a compromise with China at such a time.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for bringing us on to this question of what Mr. Kishida will mean for all of these issues, because it brings us very naturally to questions. One of them here is from Tim Hitchens, which I'll read off the screen. The questions seem to be coming in mainly via the comment or the chat function. So Tim Hitchens says, I'd be interested in views on whether the new Kishida administration will tackle this set of issues differently. His style's always been much less hawkish, bordering on the lightweight, says Tim. Does Beijing rate him at all? So, Cherry, that's obviously one for you. What do you think Beijing makes of this change of regime in Japan. And Michael, I'll come to you afterwards, because obviously Abe was a very important figure, the longest serving Japanese prime minister for goodness knows how long, one who had a kind of very strong image overseas. If we go back to a period of slightly sort of less dynamic Japanese leadership, I don't know how that'll be viewed in Washington. But Cherry, you first.
Okay, well, my reading on this is that seems to be that China-Japan relations reach some kind of like stalemate, I would say. So the past year, back to 2020, it seems there's a state visit agreed by Xi Jinping and Shinzo Abe. You know, every 10 years you have the cycles of up and down. It seems now we've reached that peak and now in the moment of go down slope. But on the other hand, I mean, Kishida is one of the very familiar figures that for the Chinese foreign minister at the time when he was served as the ambassador to Japan already know him quite well and worked with him. So I think the channel for communication between two sides remain open. But when it comes to strategic interests and strategic issues on Indo-Pacific, I think China will come up with very strong words. And also don't forget, I mean, the sense of anti-Japan sentiment in China become substantially stronger than in the past. I mean, even just judging by the time of Tokyo Olympics has already really shown already. So I would say the Sino-Japanese relations will continue to be very bumpy, even if the two sides remain talk at each other.
Yeah. So Michael, what do you make of it all? I should add that Tim Hitchens' verdict on Kishida as a lightweight comes from a certain depth of experience, since Tim was our ambassador in Tokyo. What do you share that assessment, and how do you see the post-Abe era in all of this?
Well, it's good to see Tim, and I see a number of other old friends on. So these are people who can talk about it probably better than I can, and have a lot of experience. We shouldn't forget that Kishida may have been mentioned. I'm sorry, I may have just not heard it. He was the longest serving Japanese foreign minister under the longest serving prime minister. So he has experience. He came out during the campaign rather hawkishly, despite Tim's argument that he's been less hawkish and dovish. He was talking about Japan having a missile strike capability in order to defend itself. But I think the bigger issue is a little bit the same thing we're talking about with Biden following Trump, is Kishida, or before Kishida, Suga following Abe, which is that just as Trump fundamentally reset China relations so that it's very hard to imagine going back to a pre-2016 mindset on US-China relations, Abe fundamentally reset Japan's foreign and security policies, and it's very hard to see a prime minister going back to a pre-Abe, pre-Abe 2, that is, not his first time, but the second time, foreign policy. And of course, that actually, some of it predated Abe with actual moves by the DPJ to increase defense spending and come up with strategic visions of the Southwest Islands, down to the Senkakus and the like. So again, we have, we're used to thinking of politics, one party or one leader gets in and things switch dramatically. And I don't think that's the case. We're in a new era for Japan's foreign policies. We see with the Queen Elizabeth being in the region and the naval exercises that just happened a week ago or so. We saw with the US Marines landing F-35s on the new Japanese carriers that this is a very different Japan that is beginning to think seriously about power projection in the region. Now, again, no nation, although Japan comes close, but no nation is going to be able to equal China or the United States in terms of military capability and capacity and power projection ability. But that doesn't mean that a country like Japan or Australia under the new AUKUS deal with nuclear submarines, or quite frankly, India, which is the largest purchaser of naval weaponry over this decade, are insignificant and will play an insignificant role. So what Kishida has actually inherited is a different Japan from his predecessors, in a Japan where so many of the restrictions on whether it's collective self-defense or arms cooperation and export, arms development cooperation export are gone. So it's not simply that you slip back into the old clothes that you were wearing. The bigger question, I think, is, does Japan's strategy match with America's strategy? Now, they'll never match perfectly, but are the two sides congruently talking about their strategic objectives and working towards them. If you look at Quad, if you look at AUKUS, I would say in general, about as good as you can expect, and of course bringing in other partners. But your point, Gideon, about another series of weak leaders, Suga lasting, a year or less, that would be the worst case scenario, and it is something that Washington would be extremely concerned about and doesn't want to relive.
Right. Okay. The next question, short but sweet, from Frank Curtis. Where does Russia fit in with all this, if at all? Yasushi, I mean, it seemed to me that one of the sort of less successful initiatives of the Abe years was this effort to have a rapprochement with Russia. He wasted a lot of energy on it, but it did show that Russia's a player still in all of this. What's the current view, and particularly, are people concerned by the growing closeness between Russia and China?
Yes, certainly, as you mentioned, the people were disappointed by how little we achieved with Russia in terms of territorial issues. And the Putin has no sign of compromising over this issue. However, I think people still consider it important to keep communicating with Russia as a way to, to hedge the threat from China. So I think that's the same with President Biden, and he spoke so badly of Putin during the campaign, but still, trying to explore the channel of communication. So I think the similar mindset is shared in Tokyo as well. It's maybe unrealistic to assume that the territory, the northern territory, will be back anytime soon, or even forever. However, it's still important to keep the communication channel with Russia, not for the sake of communication itself, but also in order to hedge China.
Yeah. And Cherry, I mean, it seems increasingly that Russia is China's most important friend. And I think Xi Jinping has visited Moscow more than any other foreign capital. There is kind of always speculation in the West that maybe it's an unstable relationship and there'll be another replay of the Russia-China split of the 70s. But for the moment, to me, it looks pretty solid, and an alliance both of interests and also of worldviews to some extent, that they see the West as adversarial, attempting to undermine their domestic stability and so on. How's it look to you, though?
Well, it looks to me, I mean, I partially agree with you, that sense of romance seems to continue between Putin and Xi. That's one thing. But on the other hand, I would say, because the two powers see the world very differently. I mean, both Xi Jinping and Putin, although they have this common sense that dislike and disagree with whatever United States has said, but obviously China sees the world that bring the economic integration, integrate itself into the world economy. That's the way for China to become successful and powerful. Whereas on the other hand, for Russia, it is to show its military might. It is to expect that still return quite relevant on issues in the MENA region and also on Central Asia. That would be something of importance for Russia. So they have a different worldview. So one thing. The second thing which I bring is the Belt and Road Initiative. That for have been many, many years that Xi Jinping encouraged Vladimir Putin that to coordinate between the Belt and Road Initiative in China and together with Putin's Eurasia Economic Union. Even though this has been quite diplomatic, warm words and talk with each other on this coordination, but there has been hardly any substantial, real economic collaboration between the two sides on these both initiatives. And also Russia traditionally sees Central Asia as its own backyard. But obviously, given China's increasing economic investments within Central Asia, and ultimately China will have to find a way and to play a security role in the Central Asia, and whether Putin will allow that, and we shall wait and to be seen. But I think I see some troubles with this partnership, and probably just because of the Central Asia issues that arise between Beijing and Moscow. And also historically, the lack of trust between the two parts, that seems to be ongoing. So I would say the China-Russia relations now perhaps at its best state, but probably will hard to go any better, any further.
And Michael, how do you think it's seen in DC? I mean, I must say, maybe I just talk to the Asia people, but I'm struck by the focus on China almost to the exclusion of Russia, even though Russia, did feature so large in Democrats' demonology after the 2016 election and continues to cause all sorts of trouble around the world. Do you think China's being stressed at the expense of a focus on Russia, or does DC or Washington see it as a kind of coherent block that they're facing now?
I don't think they see it as a coherent block. I think they see it as a marriage of convenience. Certainly anyone who knows the history between Russia and China would not, think that these are going to be natural partners with a congruence of interests. And I think I like the way that Cherry put it, that this is probably as good as it's going to get. I think it's a bigger question of the US being able to chew gum and walk at the same time, meaning can it deal with two geopolitical, geostrategic challenges or challengers at once. Now, if you look at our old national security strategies under George W. Bush, the construct was two major wars at once. And before that, of course, that certainly was what the US was planning, and that was increasingly narrowed down and necked down so that there's all sorts of different phraseology, but essentially it's we can fight one and we try to do our best and hold at another one, meaning to your point that, the US, unfortunately, I think seems to shift attention. And in fact, there's an argument, a historical debate to have over the post-Cold War decade. And again, 9/11 knocked us off that trajectory, but the post-Cold War decade, which seemed to then, once the Soviet Union had dissolved and was no longer a geostrategic challenge, suddenly the US shifted its attention to China. And so now it's just been a China focus. Obviously, then there was 9/11, in which for at least a decade, the US seemed to not pay any attention to China for the most part. I mean, occasionally when it had to, there's always North Korea floating off there. But 99% of the attention was put on terrorism and the Middle East, and then back after that to China. So it's an important question, I think, about the capability of strategic depth that the United States, or strategic breadth, maybe is a better way to put it, that the United States can have. The hyperventilation over Russia after the 2016 election was pure domestic politics. It had nothing to do with actual strategic concern about what was going on in Ukraine, about Europe. We'll see what happens with this winter, with the energy shortages that Europe faces, that the UK faces. Clearly, what you saw, not clearly, I mean, just a fact, what the Biden administration did was drop opposition and any sanctions against Nord Stream 2, which allows Russia to have a dominant energy position in Europe. Whether this will turn out badly and then force the United States to begin thinking about how to act with partners is open. But the larger question of having this strategic competence is important. I would just say at the end, I'm sorry, I just want to mention one quick thing. We hollowed out our Russia ability, capability, knowledge, and human capital after the Cold War. We didn't invest in it. So we're now 30 years on from really investing in people who've been watching Russia, thinking about Russia in the way that we did during the Cold War. And so we are, unfortunately, I would say, as we are even with China today, behind the eight ball on being able to really have a solid granular understanding of what's going on, the way that we did in the Cold War with area studies, as imperfect as that was.
Okay, well, we've got about 5 minutes to go. So I'm going to pose one more question off the chat, and you'll have to give kind of quick responses to a huge question, which is, do the USA and its allies need to deter China from the use of force over Taiwan by threatening it less ambiguously? In other words, ditch the policy of strategic ambiguity and say, yeah, we will defend Taiwan if it's attacked. Yasushi, I'll give you that one to you first. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think the sort of happy hours of the so-called strategic patient ambiguity is getting over. So I think the Quad and AUKUS is sending a clear message to Beijing that you cannot continue to behave like this, and we don't sit quietly no longer. So having said that, so I appreciate this new architecture. But having said that, I'm kind of concerned with the gap of determination to fight between China and other, like-minded countries. That is, I think, Xi Jinping doesn't care how many Chinese soldiers get killed in order to take back Taiwan, whereas the countries like democratic countries like US and Japan, and maybe UK as well, having your citizen get killed, your soldier get killed is very much political liability. So it's very difficult in democratic countries if we have elections. So the biggest worry I have for the future of Taiwan is this point.
Okay. Cherry, what do you think? How do you think Beijing would react if the Americans said, okay, we're ditching strategic ambiguity, we will defend Taiwan if it's attacked?
Well, firstly, I think I disagree with what Yasushi said in here that if Xi Jinping doesn't care that his citizen got killed. I think he probably cared enormously, because that's also relevant to his governing legitimacy as well. So I think that on that layer, already within China, there seems to be a talk over the last weekend suggesting that if that's the consequences of reunification is war, and perhaps that's the worst strategy that China would have to choose. So that already really laid the front, saying China will not tolerate having a broken economy on the one hand for the expenses of having the national unity. So I would say Beijing will take the signal, but this does not prevent that Beijing will play with the fire on the edge by having more military, some kind of like military goals with Taiwan. But then on the other hand, when it comes to the actual military escalation, I think the chance is low.
Okay. Michael, last word for you, and you've got about a minute. Do you think America will revisit strategic ambiguity, and do you think they should?
Well, I think we already are. It's a big debate. This is a critical question. I think what's more likely, and I agree in part both with Cherry and Yasushi, I think it's a lot easier to push ourselves into a corner saying that we're going to defend Taiwan. Japan's talking about it now, which means we don't want to get too far behind or separated from our key ally in Asia on this. But the key question, which is Yasushi raises, do we mean it? To say that we will, to say that we no longer have strategic ambiguity and that we will defend Taiwan, and then not to, if it comes to what Cherry said is a low probability. If we don't do it, I mean, then that completely overturns the geostrategic board in Asia in terms of US alliances, credibility, presence, and the like. So no one knows the answer, but we can certainly know what we think we mean when we say it. And if we haven't thought it through, it won't end pretty.
Okay. Well, thank you for that thought, and thank you to all three of you for a really fascinating discussion and covered a huge amount of ground. Let me now hand back to Jason in Cambridge.
Yeah, well, thank you very much indeed. All I need to say really is that was a fantastic panel, even by our normally very high standards. And so we're really grateful to all of you for taking part. And thank you so much also, Gideon, for chairing it. Thank you everybody for taking part, and we'll see you at a Daiwa Foundation event before too long, I hope.